as the excavator's metal teeth bit into the earth behind his uncle's abandoned scrapyard. Jackson Cooper felt the weight of desperation pressing down on his shoulders. The harsh summer sun beat relentlessly on his back, each drop of sweat a reminder of the crushing debt that threatened to swallow what remained of his family's legacy. At 38, with calloused hands and deepening lines around his eyes, Jackson had never imagined his life would come to this, operating rented machinery on a worthless inheritance, chasing what was likely a fool's hope. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Jackson had sat across from Miranda Reynolds, the regional bank manager whose sympathetic expression couldn't soften the finality of her words. "I'm sorry, Jackson. We've extended every possible deadline. Without a substantial payment by the end of the month, we'll have to foreclose." The family farm, 200 acres of once fertile Iowa soil that had supported Coopers for 4 generations, was slipping away, victim to 3 consecutive years of drought, rising costs, and plummeting crop prices. That same afternoon, as Jackson had sat at his kitchen table staring at final notice letters, his phone rang. Uncle Hank, his father's eccentric older brother, had passed away. The lawyer's voice had been professionally detached as he explained that Jackson was the sole beneficiary of Hank's estate, 5 acres of rural land, cluttered with what most would call junk, and what Hank had proudly called Cooper's mechanical salvation. "Your uncle was unique," the lawyer had said delicately. "The property isn't worth much, but it's free and clear. He left specific instructions that you should dig where the old elm cast its shadow at noon." Whatever that means. Jackson had almost laughed through his despair. Uncle Hank, the family oddball who collected forgotten machinery and spoke of conspiracy theories involving banks and government cover-ups. The uncle who'd once told a 10-year-old Jackson that real treasure isn't in banks, it's where no one thinks to look. The scrapyard looked even worse than Jackson remembered from his childhood visits. Decades of accumulated machinery, automobile carcasses, and industrial remnants sprawled across the property like a mechanical graveyard. The small cinder block building that had served as both Hank's office and living quarters stood silent, its windows clouded with dust. Jackson had spent the first day just walking the property, trying to make sense of his inheritance. The ancient elm tree his uncle mentioned had died years ago, leaving only a massive stump near the eastern edge of the property. By noon the following day, Jackson stood watching its non-existent shadow, feeling foolish and desperate in equal measure. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself, but desperation drove him to rent an excavator anyway. With the bank deadline looming and nothing left to lose, Jackson was willing to indulge his uncle's final riddle. If nothing else, clearing some of this junk might make the property marginally more sellable. The excavator hit something solid on the 3rd day of digging, the impact reverberating up through the machine and into Jackson's bones. His heart raced as he carefully cleared away more soil, revealing what appeared to be a massive metal door embedded in concrete. It took another hour of careful digging to expose the entire structure, what looked unmistakably like a bank vault door, its once gleaming surface now tarnished by decades underground. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The date stamped into the metal 1925 made Jackson's breath catch. This was no ordinary safe. This was something that predated even his grandfather's time on the family farm. The heavy wheel handle was locked in place, a sophisticated mechanism for its era clearly designed to protect whatever lay inside from unwanted intrusion. Jackson's phone buzzed in his pocket. Carl Whitman, his oldest friend and the local mechanic who'd helped him keep his farm equipment running long past its prime. "Found anything interesting in that junkyard yet?" Carl's voice carried a hint of the same sympathy everyone in town seemed to offer lately. the kind that acknowledged Jackson's impending financial ruin without directly mentioning it. "You need to get out here," Jackson said, his voice strange even to his own ears. "And bring your cutting tools. The heavy ones." Within an hour, Carl's battered pickup truck rattled up the overgrown drive, sending dust clouds billowing in its wake. The stocky mechanic whistled low and long when he saw the excavated vault door. "Your uncle was even crazier than people said," he muttered, circling the structure with professional curiosity. "This isn't just any safe. This looks like something from an old bank. The real deal, not some home security box. Can you open it?" Jackson asked, not bothering to hide the desperate edge in his voice. Carl ran his fingers over the ancient locking mechanism, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but we should call the authorities first. Something like this, buried on private property. There could be legal issues." Jackson shook his head firmly. "This is my property now, and whatever's inside belonged to my uncle. We're not calling anyone until I know what I'm dealing with." The afternoon stretched into evening as Carl worked on the vault door, the rhythmic sound of metal against metal punctuated by occasional curses. The sun was setting, painting the scrapyard in shades of amber and gold, when they heard the satisfying click of the mechanism finally giving way. "That should do it," Carl said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Whatever your uncle was hiding, we're about to find out." Together, they gripped the massive wheel handle and turned. Decades of soil and moisture had taken their toll, but the engineering was impressive. The door moved, grudgingly at first, then with surprising ease. As it swung open, the fading daylight revealed a chamber roughly the size of a small room, its contents obscured in shadow. The beam of Jackson's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating what at first appeared to be ordinary storage metal filing cabinets, wooden crates, and stacks of what looked like ledgers. But as the light played across the room, something gleamed in response, something that made both men freeze in disbelief. Gold, not just a few coins or trinkets, but neat stacks of gold bars arranged on metal shelving along the back wall of the vault. Jackson's hand trembled, causing the flashlight beam to dance across the impossible treasure. "Holy," Carl whispered, unable to complete the thought. But the gold was only the beginning. As they ventured further into the vault, the flashlight revealed more stacks of currency in denominations neither man had seen before. Bonds and stock certificates yellowed with age, and several small wooden boxes containing what appeared to be jewelry and gemstones. "This is impossible," Jackson murmured, lifting one of the heavy gold bars. The weight of it in his hand, solid, substantial, seemed to ground the moment in reality. This wasn't a dream or delusion. This was real. Carl picked up one of the ledgers, its leather binding cracked with age, and carefully opened it. "These are records," he said, scanning the meticulously handwritten entries. "Dates, names, amounts. Jackson, I think your uncle's vault might be connected to something bigger than just family savings." Jackson was only half listening, his mind racing with calculations. Even a fraction of what he was seeing would be enough to save the farm, enough to pay off every debt, enough to modernize his equipment and implement the sustainable farming methods he'd been researching but could never afford. This wasn't just financial salvation, this was transformation. Among the ledgers and documents, Jackson found an envelope with his name written in his uncle's distinctive scrawl. With unsteady fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear Jackson," it began. "If you're reading this, you've solved my final puzzle. Good. You always were the smartest of the Cooper clan, even if you were too conventional for your own good." A small smile tugged at Jackson's lips despite the surreal circumstances. Uncle Hank's personality leapt off the page, as vibrant and unconventional in death as he had been in life. "What you've found isn't just money, it's history, and it comes with responsibility. Back in 1925, your great-grandfather Elias Cooper wasn't just a farmer. When the Farmers and Merchants Bank of Millerville collapsed during the financial panic that foreshadowed the Great Depression, He was part of a coalition of local businessmen who stepped in to protect the community's assets. Jackson looked up from the letter to the fortune surrounding him, beginning to understand. The big banks were coming to buy up the remains for pennies on the dollar, which would have destroyed the community. So Elias and 12 others pooled their resources, purchased the bank's building, and secretly recovered its assets before the financial vultures arrived. They became the guardians of their neighbors' financial future, returning funds as needed while keeping the operation hidden from government oversight that was often corrupted by powerful financial interests. The letter detailed how the operation continued through Prohibition and the Depression, with the coalition gradually returning funds to their rightful owners or their descendants. By the time Uncle Hank inherited the responsibility in the 1970s, most accounts had been settled except for those whose owners had disappeared or died without heirs. "I've spent decades tracking down the remaining legitimate heirs," Hank's letter continued. "The enclosed ledger marked outstanding shows what remains unclaimed. The rest, approximately 60% of what you see before you, has no legal claimants left. According to our coalition's original agreement, it now belongs to the last guardian. That's you, nephew." Jackson sat heavily on one of the wooden crates, the letter trembling in his hands. Even after accounting for the outstanding claims his uncle had meticulously documented, the remaining fortune was substantial enough to change everything. "There's one more thing," Hank's letter concluded. "The coalition didn't just protect money. In the second chamber, yes, there's more behind the north wall. You'll find something even more valuable: the truth. Records that certain powerful interests would prefer stayed buried. Documentation of how the financial crises that devastated rural America were engineered, not accidental. Use it wisely. The truth can save more than just one farm. It can change the system. But it can also make you powerful enemies. Trust no one until you understand what you're holding." The letter was signed simply, "Your unconventional uncle, Henry Cooper, last guardian of the First Coalition." Carl, who had been examining other documents while Jackson read, looked up with an expression of dawning comprehension. "Jackson, these records. They contain names of banks and financial institutions that still exist today. Records of transactions that don't match official histories. If your uncle was right, this is evidence of systematic manipulation of agricultural markets going back nearly a century." Jackson carefully refolded his uncle's letter, his mind racing with implications. The farm, his most immediate concern just hours ago, now seemed like merely the first thread in a much larger tapestry. He faced a choice that would define not just his future, but potentially the future of many others who, like him, had struggled against seemingly insurmountable financial forces. "We need to document everything," Jackson said finally, his voice steady with newfound purpose. "Before we move anything, before we tell anyone what we found. Everything needs to be photographed, cataloged, and secured." As the full moon rose over the scrapyard, casting long shadows across the excavated vault, Jackson Cooper stood at the threshold of a mystery that had begun almost a century earlier. His uncle's final gift wasn't just the gold and currency. That would save his farm. It was the opportunity to continue a legacy of guardianship that had secretly shaped his community's history through the most challenging economic times. The excavator that had unearthed this incredible discovery sat silently in the moonlight, its work complete. But for Jackson, the real work was just beginning. Behind him lay generations of family struggle on land that demanded everything and often gave too little in return. Before him stretched a new path, one where the Cooper name might stand for something larger than one man's battle against financial ruin. "Tomorrow," Jackson told Carl as they secured the vault for the night, "we find out what's in the second chamber. And then we decide who needs to know about it." As they walked back toward the dilapidated cinder block building that had been his uncle's home, Jackson felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope, not just for his own future, but for a chance to address the systemic injustices that had quietly devastated rural communities like his own for generations. The weight of desperation that had pressed down on him just that morning had been replaced by something else, the weight of purpose, of responsibility, of unexpected legacy. In the distance, the lights of the small town where his family had farmed for generations twinkled like stars fallen to earth. Those lights represented families like his own, all struggling against forces they barely understood. Forces that perhaps his eccentric Uncle Hank had understood all too well. Jackson Cooper had arrived at his uncle's scrapyard as a desperate man with nothing left to lose. He would leave it as the inheritor of both fortune and purpose, the last guardian of a coalition formed in 1925, and perhaps the first guardian of a new chapter in a story that had waited patiently beneath the soil for its moment to emerge into the light. Dawn broke over the scrapyard, bathing the rusted metal in golden light as Jackson Cooper and Carl Whitman prepared to enter the vault's second chamber. They had spent a sleepless night cataloging the contents of the main vault, photographing every document, every gold bar, every stack of currency. The magnitude of what they had discovered still hadn't fully registered, the implications, too vast to process in a single night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ready? Jackson asked, positioning his flashlight toward the seam in the north wall that Uncle Hank had mentioned in his letter. Carl nodded, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by focused intensity. The events of the previous day had transformed them both to ordinary men suddenly thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The north wall of the vault appeared solid at first glance, but closer inspection revealed subtle differences in the concrete texture. Jackson ran his fingers along the seam, feeling for any mechanism that might trigger its opening. After several minutes of careful examination, Carl spotted a small recess near the floor, cleverly disguised as a structural imperfection. "There," he said, pointing. "That doesn't match the rest of the wall." Jackson knelt and pressed his fingers into the depression. Something clicked inside the wall, and a section roughly 3 feet wide began to swing inward on hidden hinges. The engineering was impressive, especially for 1925, creating a doorway that would be virtually invisible when closed. The beam of Jackson's flashlight revealed a much smaller chamber, perhaps 8 feet square. Unlike the main vault with its gold and currency, this space was dedicated entirely to information storage. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, each drawer meticulously labeled by year. A small desk and chair occupied the center of the room, positioned as if waiting for someone to sit down and continue work that had been interrupted decades ago. "This was your uncle's office," Carl said softly, noticing a pair of reading glasses resting on the desk's surface. "He spent time in here working." Jackson approached the desk, his flashlight illuminating a leather-bound journal open to its final entry, dated just 3 weeks before Uncle Hank's death. The handwriting was shakier than in the letter Jackson had read yesterday, the words of a man whose body was failing but whose mind remained sharp. "Final confirmation received," the entry read. "The pattern holds. The 1925 collapse, 1933 foreclosures, 1980s farm crisis, 2008 credit freeze, all engineered by the same network, using the same mechanisms, all creating the same outcome, consolidation of agricultural lands under corporate control. The coalition's records are now complete. Time to pass the torch." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson felt a chill despite the warm morning. His uncle's conspiracy theories, the ramblings that family members had dismissed with eye rolls and changed subjects suddenly, seemed less like paranoia and more like the conclusions of a man who had access to information others didn't. "Start with the earliest records," Jackson instructed Carl, I'll begin with the most recent. Let's see if we can understand what Uncle Hank discovered. The morning stretched into afternoon as they carefully examined the contents of the filing cabinets. What emerged was a meticulously documented history of what appeared to be coordinated market manipulation spanning nearly a century. The earliest files contained newspaper clippings, bank records, and correspondence related to the 1925 collapse of rural banks throughout the Midwest, all pointing to a coordinated effort by larger financial institutions to absorb smaller competitors. "Look at this," Carl said, holding up a document from 1924. It's an internal memo from National Financial Group. They still exist today, bigger than ever, outlining a strategy to create controlled instability in agricultural lending markets. They knew exactly what they were doing. Jackson, meanwhile, had discovered something equally disturbing in the more recent files. And here's evidence they're still doing it. These records from 2008 show the same institutional investors who were publicly claiming to support family farms were privately funding the entities foreclosing on them. As the picture became clearer, so did Uncle Hank's role. He hadn't just been the eccentric guardian of a hidden fortune. He had been documenting a continuing pattern of market manipulation, specifically targeting rural communities and family-owned farms. The coalition that had begun as an emergency response to a local banking collapse had evolved into something more profound, a multi-generational effort to preserve evidence of systemic injustice. "Your uncle was building a case," Carl said, gesturing to the carefully organized files. "This isn't just history, it's evidence." Jackson nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. But evidence for what? A court case? Public exposure? What was his endgame? The answer came in the form of a sealed envelope taped to the underside of the desk drawer, marked simply, "For the last guardian, the final phase." Inside was another letter in Uncle Hank's handwriting, along with what appeared to be a carefully constructed plan. "Jackson," the letter began, "if you're reading this, you've discovered both the means and the evidence. Now you need the strategy." The coalition's original 13 members didn't just protect their neighbors' savings, they created a blueprint for confronting corrupt financial systems. That blueprint, updated for our times, is enclosed. The accompanying documents outlined a carefully constructed approach for using both the financial resources from the main vault and the evidence from the hidden chamber to create lasting change. It wasn't about exposure alone, which could be dismissed or buried by powerful interests, but about strategic leverage and community empowerment. "The pattern persists because rural communities remain isolated from each other," Hank had written. "Individual farmers facing foreclosure believe their failure is personal, not systemic. The coalition's final purpose is to connect these communities and provide them with both the evidence and the resources to create resilient local financial systems outside the control of those who engineered their hardships." By mid-afternoon, Jackson and Carl had transported the most critical documents to the relative security of Uncle Hank's cinder-block building. The sun beat down mercilessly as they worked, but neither man noticed the heat or their growing exhaustion. The magnitude of what they were uncovering demanded their complete attention. "We need help," Jackson admitted finally, rubbing his eyes. "There's too much here for just the two of us to process, let alone act on." Carl nodded, but his expression was cautious. "Who can we trust with this?" "Your uncle maintains secrecy for a reason." Jackson considered the question carefully. The stakes were enormous, not just the fortune in gold and currency, which would certainly attract attention from authorities and possibly dangerous interests, but the evidence that could potentially challenge powerful financial institutions. One wrong move could lead to the treasure being confiscated and the evidence buried forever. "I think I know someone," he said finally. "My cousin Rebecca, Uncle Hank's other niece. She's an economics professor at the State University. If anyone can make sense of these financial records and help us understand the bigger picture, it's her." Carl looked skeptical. You sure about that? Your uncle didn't mention her in his letters. He wouldn't have known her professional background. They lost touch years ago when she moved away for graduate school. Jackson paused, weighing his next words carefully. Besides, we need someone who understands economic systems and who doesn't have a direct interest in the financial assets. Her academic perspective could be valuable. After securing the vault and disguising the excavation site as best they could, Jackson placed the call to his cousin. He provided minimal details, just enough to pique her interest without revealing the full magnitude of their discovery. Uncle Hank left something important behind, he explained. Something that might explain those economic theories he was always talking about. I think you should see it. Rebecca's arrival the following morning brought a new energy to their investigation. At 42, she was a respected economist whose research focused on rural economic development and the challenges facing agricultural communities. Her initial skepticism quickly gave way to professional fascination as Jackson and Carl showed her the evidence they'd uncovered. This is, she began, then stopped, unable to find adequate words. If these records are authentic, this is the most comprehensive documentation of predatory financial practices targeting rural America I've ever seen. This could change our understanding of agricultural economics for the past century. Jackson explained, Uncle Hank's vision, using both the financial resources and the evidence to create sustainable change rather than simply exposing wrongdoing. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully, her academic mind already processing the possibilities. Your uncle was right about one thing, she said, examining a particularly detailed set of documents from the 1980s farm crisis. Isolated exposure wouldn't work. These institutions have weathered scandals before. They have legal teams specifically designed to minimize damage from revelations like these. She spread several documents across the small table in Uncle Hank's living quarters. But what if we approach this differently? Not just as exposing past wrongs, but as creating a new model for the future? Over the next several days, a plan began to take shape. Rebecca's academic connections provided access to economic modeling tools that helped them understand the potential impact of different approaches. Carl's practical knowledge of the community who was struggling, who was close to foreclosure, who might be trusted added a crucial local dimension. And Jackson, with his deep connection to the land and his understanding of what was at stake for farming families, became the heart of their emerging strategy. The coalition's original purpose was community preservation through direct financial intervention, Rebecca explained, outlining their approach on a makeshift whiteboard. We can do the same thing, but with 100 years of additional knowledge and technology at our disposal. Their plan had multiple phases. The first involved establishing a legal entity, a community development, financial institution that could legitimately receive and manage the unclaimed portion of the vault's contents. This would provide a transparent framework for using the resources while protecting them from immediate seizure by authorities who might question their origin. The second phase would focus on targeted relief for the most vulnerable farms in the community, preventing imminent foreclosures while building a network of agricultural producers committed to sustainable practices. This wasn't charity, it was strategic investment in the community's future resilience. The third phase was the most ambitious, using the evidence Uncle Hank had collected to create leverage for policy changes that would prevent future predatory practices. This wouldn't happen through a single dramatic exposure, but through carefully timed revelations tied to specific reform proposals. Your uncle understood something fundamental, Rebecca told Jackson as they refined their approach. Real change doesn't come from exposing wrongdoing alone. It comes from building alternatives that make the old systems obsolete. A week after discovering the vault, they were ready to implement the first phase of their plan. Jackson, as the legal inheritor of Uncle Hank's property, would establish the Millerville Agricultural Heritage Foundation, with Rebecca serving as economic advisor and Carl as community liaison. The foundation's stated mission, Preserving the agricultural legacy of the region provided a plausible explanation for sudden financial resources while keeping their true origin private. The morning they were scheduled to meet with a trusted legal advisor to begin the process, Jackson woke before dawn and walked alone to the excavation site. The vault door stood partially open, just as they had left it, concealed by tarps and scrap metal. In the growing light, he could make out his uncle's weathered workbench in the distance, still covered with half-finished projects and scattered tools. For the first time since discovering the vault, Jackson allowed himself to truly feel the emotions that had been overshadowed by practical concerns and strategic planning. Gratitude for his uncle's foresight, anger at the systems that had pushed so many farming families to the brink, determination to honor the legacy of the original coalition, and hope, tentative but growing stronger, that perhaps his family's connection to this land wouldn't end with his generation after all. "We'll make it count," he promised quietly, as if his uncle might somehow hear. "Everything you preserved, everything you protected, it won't be wasted." As the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the scrapyard, Jackson could almost imagine the 13 original coalition members, his great-grandfather among them, standing in similar contemplation almost a century earlier. They had faced their moment of crisis with courage and creativity, finding a way to protect their community when official systems failed. Now it was his turn to continue that legacy, not just for his own farm, but for all those who still believed in the value of working the land and feeding their communities. The sound of approaching vehicles broke his reverie. Rebecca and Carl had arrived, along with the lawyer who would help them navigate the complex legal considerations of their plan. As Jackson walked back toward Uncle Hank's building, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose larger than his own survival, a connection to something that transcended his individual struggle. The Cooper family had worked the soil for generations, their hands shaped by the endless cycle of planting and harvest. Now Jackson would work a different kind of soil, the fertile ground of community resilience and economic justice. And from that soil, perhaps something even more valuable than crops might grow, a future where rural communities could thrive, not despite the larger economic systems, but because they had created better ones. The morning sun illuminated the scattered machinery of Uncle Hank's scrapyard, transforming what had once seemed like worthless junk into a landscape of possibility. Just as his uncle had seen value in what others discarded, Jackson now saw potential where others might see only crisis and decline. The journey ahead would be challenging, filled with legal complexities and powerful opposition. But for the first time in years, Jackson Cooper was no longer simply fighting against loss. He was building towards something new. And that made all the difference. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the Millerville Community Center as Jackson Cooper stood before the gathered crowd. 3 months had passed since the discovery of Uncle Hank's vault, and the transformation was already visible, not just in Jackson's own circumstances, but throughout the struggling farming community. The lines of worry that had etched themselves into his face had softened, replaced by new lines of determination around his eyes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Millerville Agricultural Heritage Foundation isn't just about preserving our past, Jackson explained, his voice steady as he addressed his neighbors. It's about securing our future. For too long, we've been told that the decline of family farms is inevitable, that we're fighting against unstoppable economic forces. Today, I'm here to tell you that's not true. Behind him, a projector displayed images of local farms that had been on the brink of foreclosure. Just weeks earlier, the Davidson place with its historic red barn, the Rodriguez family's organic vegetable operation, the Young family's dairy that had been producing milk for 4 generations. All had received strategic investments from the foundation, structured not as handouts but as partnerships that preserved both the farmers' dignity and their autonomy. What's happening in Millerville isn't charity, Jackson continued. Meeting the eyes of farmers who had been his competitors and were now becoming his allies. It's community self-determination. It's remembering that we've always been strongest when we stand together. The journey to this moment had not been simple or straightforward. Legitimizing the resources from Uncle Hank's vault had required careful legal navigation. With the help of Rebecca's academic connections and the discreet assistance of a law firm specializing in unusual estate matters, they had established a credible narrative. Uncle Hank, through decades of mechanical salvage work and prescient investments in precious metals, had accumulated substantial assets that he had designated for community benefit. The IRS had questions, of course, but the Foundation's legal team had anticipated them. The gradual introduction of assets, never too much at once to trigger additional scrutiny, provided the appearance of ongoing investment returns, rather than a sudden windfall. The strategy had been effective. While some eyebrows were raised, no serious investigations had materialized. More complex had been the human element convincing proud, independent farmers to accept help from a newly established foundation with no track record. Jackson had started with Carl's cousin, David Mitchell, whose farm equipment repair business was on the verge of bankruptcy due to outstanding loans. "I don't take handouts," David had insisted when Jackson first approached him, his weathered face flushed with embarrassment and pride. "It's not a handout," Jackson had explained patiently. "It's an investment. The Foundation believes that keeping skilled equipment repair services local is essential for our agricultural community. We're offering a business partnership." The carefully structured deal had allowed David to clear his most pressing debts while maintaining complete ownership of his business. The only condition was that he provide discounted repair services to Foundation-affiliated farms, a condition that actually increased his customer base as the network of participating farms grew. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Word had spread quickly after that. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, the visible turnaround of David's operation had sparked curiosity. One by one, struggling farmers had cautiously approached the Foundation, each expecting rejection, each surprised by the practical, dignity-preserving support they received. Now, 3 months in, the Foundation's impact was becoming undeniable. Foreclosure notices that had been commonplace were increasingly rare. Local suppliers reported increased business as farms that had been cutting costs to survive were now investing in improvements. The community bank, which had been processing a steady stream of farm liquidations, found itself instead handling expansion loans backed by Foundation guarantees. But as Jackson looked out at the faces of his neighbors in the community center, he knew they had only completed the first phase of Uncle Hank's plan. The immediate crisis had been addressed, the hemorrhaging of family farms had been slowed. Now came the more challenging work, creating sustainable systems that could withstand future attempts at financial manipulation. "The Foundation's support is just the beginning," Jackson explained, nodding to Rebecca, who stepped forward to take over the presentation. Rebecca Cooper, who had initially planned to stay in Millerville for just a few days, had extended her leave of absence from the university. The intellectual challenge of implementing Uncle Hank's vision of translating century-old financial protection strategies into modern frameworks had proven irresistible to her academic mind. "For generations, we've been told that small-scale agriculture can't compete with industrial operations," she began, advancing to the next slide in their presentation. "The data tells a different story. When we remove predatory financing from the equation, family farms are not just viable, they're often more productive per acre than their corporate counterparts." The next hour was dedicated to explaining Phase 2 of the Foundation's plan, the creation of a local agricultural cooperative that would allow independent farms to achieve economies of scale in purchasing, processing, and distribution without sacrificing their autonomy. The model wasn't new. Agricultural cooperatives had existed for generations, but the Foundation's approach incorporated lessons from both successes and failures throughout rural America. By pooling resources for critical infrastructure while maintaining individual farm identity and decision-making, we create resilience, Rebecca explained. No single bank can threaten the entire system. No single market fluctuation can wipe out a generation of family farms. The presentation concluded with Carl outlining the practical next steps, a series of workshops where farmers could learn more about cooperative membership, the schedule for infrastructure development, and opportunities for leadership within the new organization. The energy in the room was palpable. A community that had been bracing for extinction was now cautiously embracing possibility. As farmers lingered afterward, forming small discussion groups and signing up for workshops, Jackson stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The evening air carried the familiar scent of late summer ripening corn, freshly cut hay, the earthy richness of soil that had supported generations of life. "You've made a good start," came a voice from behind him. Jackson turned to find Miranda Reynolds, the bank manager who had delivered his foreclosure warning just months earlier. "Miranda," he acknowledged with a nod. Their relationship had been complicated by recent events. The Millerville Community Bank, where she had worked for 15 years, had initially viewed the Foundation with suspicion, a mysterious new entity disrupting established financial patterns. But as the positive economic ripple effects became evident, that suspicion had gradually given way to cautious cooperation. "The cooperative model is sound," she continued, her professional assessment evident in her tone. "But you know you're making waves beyond Millerville, don't you? The regional agricultural lenders are asking questions about what's happening here." Jackson had expected this. Uncle Hank's records had made it clear that any attempt to disrupt established patterns of agricultural finance would eventually attract attention from larger interests. "We're not doing anything revolutionary," he replied carefully. "Cooperatives have been part of farming communities for over a century." Miranda gave him a measured look. "It's not what you're doing, it's how effectively you're doing it. And how quickly. Agricultural communities don't typically transform this rapidly without outside corporate investment. People notice." She handed him a business card with a handwritten number on the back. "This is my personal cell. Call me if you start feeling pressure from outside financial institutions. I may be able to help navigate it." Jackson accepted the card with surprise. "I thought the bank would be on their side, not ours." Miranda's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I've approved too many farm foreclosures over the years, watched too many families lose everything. Whatever your uncle left you, whatever you're doing with it, it's working. Sometimes you have to choose between institutional loyalty and the community where you live." As she walked away toward her car, Jackson tucked the card into his pocket, adding Miranda to his mental list of unexpected allies. The coalition was growing, not just farmers now, but local business owners, community leaders, and apparently even bankers who recognized that a thriving agricultural community benefited everyone. Back inside the community center, the energy remained high as farmers who had previously seen each other as competitors discussed potential collaboration. Jackson caught Carl's eye across the room, both men sharing a moment of quiet satisfaction. Phase 2 was launching successfully. But even as he rejoined the conversations, helping answer questions and address concerns, Jackson's mind was already turning to Phase 3, the most challenging and potentially dangerous part of Uncle Hank's plan. The evidence of market manipulation that filled the hidden chamber of the vault wasn't just history. It was ammunition in a battle they hadn't yet begun to fight. Rebecca found him later that evening as they were packing up the presentation materials. "We need to talk about the records," she said quietly, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "I've been cross-referencing Uncle Hank's documentation with publicly available financial data. The patterns aren't just historical, they're ongoing." Jackson nodded, having suspected as much. How current? Very, she replied, her academic detachment momentarily slipping to reveal genuine concern. The same financial institutions implicated in 1980's farm crisis are positioning themselves for another round of agricultural consolidation. Different methods, same outcome, more family farms absorbed into corporate operations. Timeline? Based on the investment patterns, 18 to 24 months. They're moving methodically, staying just under the radar of regulatory scrutiny. Jackson considered this information, weighing it against their current progress. The foundation had successfully stabilized the immediate local crisis. The cooperative was launching with strong community support. But these achievements would mean little if larger financial forces could simply adjust their tactics and try again. We need to accelerate Phase 3, he decided. Not just documenting the patterns for eventual exposure, but actively disrupting them. Rebecca looked uncertain. That's significantly riskier than what we've done so far. We're talking about directly challenging institutions with virtually unlimited legal resources and political influence. We don't have to challenge them directly, not yet, Jackson clarified. We just need to make their strategy visible to those who can act on the information, regulators, agricultural advocacy organizations, journalists with the right expertise. He outlined his thinking, a careful, strategic disclosure of selected evidence from Uncle Hank's records, distributed to multiple recipients simultaneously to prevent any single point of suppression. Not a dramatic public expose, but a targeted information campaign designed to force transparency in agricultural financing before the next crisis could fully materialize. It's still risky, Rebecca cautioned. These institutions have buried inconvenient evidence before. That's why timing and distribution are everything, Jackson acknowledged. We need to create a situation where burying the information is more problematic than addressing it. The community center had emptied now, leaving just Jackson, Rebecca, and Carl to lock up. As they walked to their vehicles under the star-filled rural sky, Jackson found himself thinking about his farm, not just as a piece of land he was struggling to save, but as part of a larger ecosystem of family operations that defined the character and resilience of rural America. Uncle Hank understood something fundamental, he said as they reached the parking lot. This isn't just about economics or agriculture. It's about whether communities get to determine their own futures or have those futures decided by distant financial calculations. Carl, who had been quietly supportive throughout the evening, spoke up. Your uncle used to say that the problem with modern banking isn't that it's too big to fail, it's that it's too distant to care. He believed financial decisions about communities should be made by people who have to live with the consequences. The three of them stood in the quiet parking lot, the gravity of what they were undertaking settling around them like the evening dew. They had moved beyond simply saving individual farms, or even establishing a more resilient local agricultural economy. They were challenging a system that had methodically extracted wealth from rural communities for generations. We should be careful, Rebecca warned, her academic mind calculating risks and probabilities. The foundation and cooperative give us a legitimate platform, but once we start releasing evidence of deliberate market manipulation, we become targets. Jackson nodded, acknowledging the danger while remaining resolute. Uncle Hank didn't preserve this evidence for 100 years, just to have us sit on it when it matters most. The original coalition didn't just protect their neighbors' money, they protected their community's right to exist. That's what we're doing too. As they parted ways for the evening, each returning to their respective roles in their growing movement, Jackson felt the weight of responsibility balanced by a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for too long. The struggle to save his own farm had expanded into something far more meaningful, a chance to address the structural forces that had decimated rural communities across America. Driving back to his farm, no longer under immediate threat of foreclosure but still requiring constant attention, Jackson found himself thinking about legacy in a new way. His great-grandfather had been part of the original coalition, ordinary people taking extraordinary action in a moment of crisis. Now, 4 generations later, that legacy continued through him, not because of bloodline or inheritance, but because he had chosen to accept the responsibility that came with knowledge. The headlights of his truck swept across the entrance to his farm, illuminating the weathered sign that had marked Cooperland for generations. Beyond it lay fields that his family had tended through world wars, economic depressions, personal tragedies, and moments of triumph. Fields that would continue to produce not just crops, but a way of life that valued rootedness, stewardship, and community. As he parked beside the farmhouse, Jackson noticed a light on in his office. He must have forgotten to turn it off before leaving for the meeting. But when he entered, he found a manila envelope on his desk that hadn't been there before. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing 3 words. "They are watching." The anonymous warning confirmed what Jackson had suspected. Their activities had not gone unnoticed by the interests they were preparing to challenge. Phase 3 would need to proceed with even greater caution than they had planned. But the warning also confirmed something else. What they were doing mattered enough to provoke a response. Jackson placed the note in his fireproof safe, where he kept the most critical documents from Uncle Hank's vault. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new strategic adjustments, perhaps even new threats. But it would also bring another day of working toward a future where rural communities controlled their own destiny. A future worth the risks they were taking to secure it. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall on fields that had known drought and abundance, crisis and recovery. The soil accepted the moisture as it had for countless generations, indifferent to human concerns, yet intimately connected to human fate. In that ancient, ongoing relationship between people and land, Jackson found his resolve strengthened. Some things were worth fighting for, even against seemingly insurmountable odds. And in Millerville, that fight was just beginning. Winter descended on Millerville with record-breaking cold, but inside the old mercantile building that now housed the Millerville Agricultural Heritage Foundation, warmth and purpose radiated from every corner. 6 months had passed since the discovery of Uncle Hank's vault, transforming not just Jackson Cooper's fate, but the trajectory of an entire community. What had begun as one man's desperate attempt to save his family farm had evolved into a movement that was attracting national attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The independent audit confirms what we've been saying, Rebecca explained to the gathered board members, her breath visible in the chilly conference room despite the overworked heating system. The cooperative model is working. Member farms have seen an average 23% increase in profitability compared to last year, with processing costs down nearly 30% through shared infrastructure. Around the table sat the unlikely leadership team that had emerged from their initial efforts. Jackson, whose practical knowledge of farming provided essential grounding. Rebecca, whose academic expertise translated complex economic principles into actionable strategies. Carl, whose deep community connections ensured no family fell through the cracks. Miranda Reynolds, who had resigned from her position at the community bank to become the foundation's financial advisor. And Pastor Michael Daniels, whose moral authority had helped legitimize their work in the eyes of skeptical community members. "It's not just about the numbers," Pastor Daniels emphasized, tapping the financial report. "It's about what I'm seeing in my congregation. Hope has returned. Young people who were planning to leave after high school are talking about staying, about finding ways to be part of the community's future." Jackson nodded, thinking about his nephew Ryan, who had recently asked about apprenticing on the farm next summer instead of seeking an internship in the city. Small shifts like these, barely noticeable individually, were collectively reweaving the social fabric that had been steadily unraveling for decades. We should acknowledge the challenges as well, Miranda cautioned, ever the pragmatist. The warning Jackson received wasn't an idle threat. Consolidated Agricultural Investments has purchased 3 banks in neighboring counties in the past month alone. They're positioning for something big. CAI, the modern incarnation of the financial interests documented in Uncle Hank's records, had emerged as their primary antagonist. Not through direct confrontation, but through strategic financial maneuvering designed to undermine the Foundation's work. Their tactics were sophisticated, pressuring regional suppliers to offer less favorable terms to cooperative members, introducing competing financial products specifically targeted at vulnerable farms, and quietly lobbying for regulatory changes that would disadvantage smaller agricultural operations. Which brings us to Phase 3, Jackson said, unlocking a briefcase containing selected documents from the vault's hidden chamber. We've stabilized the local situation. The cooperative is functioning effectively. But unless we address the systemic issues, we're just building sandcastles before a rising tide. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Phase 3 had been refined considerably since their initial discussions. Rather than a broad release of historical evidence, they had developed a more strategic approach, providing specific, actionable information to carefully selected recipients who could create maximum impact with minimal risk to the Foundation itself. The first package goes out tomorrow, Rebecca confirmed, indicating a sealed envelope addressed to Senator Catherine Morrison, chair of the Senate Agricultural Committee and a longtime advocate for family farms. Historical evidence connecting current TA executives to the engineered farm crisis of the 1980s, along with documentation of their current consolidation strategy. Similar packages were prepared for the state attorney general, 3 trusted journalists with established records of financial investigation, and the leadership of the National Family Farm Coalition. Each contained slightly different information, ensuring that if one recipient was compromised or chose not to act, the overall strategy would remain intact. Once these are delivered, Jackson explained, we move to the public phase, the announcement of the Heartland Agricultural Security Initiative. HASI represented the boldest aspect of their plan, a multi-state network of cooperatives and community-owned financial institutions designed to create a firewall against the predatory practices documented in Uncle Hank's records. The Millerville model would serve as proof of concept, demonstrating that alternatives to corporate agricultural finance weren't just idealistic dreams but practical, functioning realities. We've already received tentative commitments from community leaders in 17 counties across 3 states, Carl reported, indicating a map with potential HASI partners highlighted. They're watching what we're doing here. They're ready to replicate it. As the meeting concluded and board members departed into the snowy evening, Jackson remained behind, studying the map. Each highlighted area represented communities like Millerville, places with deep agricultural traditions facing similar pressures from corporate consolidation. Places where people were fighting to maintain not just their livelihoods, but their way of life. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Cooper? The Foundation's receptionist looked concerned. There's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent, something about your uncle's property. Jackson felt a spike of adrenaline. The security measures they'd implemented around the vault had been comprehensive 24-hour surveillance, reinforced concrete barriers disguised as landscaping features, motion sensors integrated with the Scrapyard's existing security system. Had something been compromised? The woman waiting in the reception area was unfamiliar mid-50s, expensively dressed in a way that stood out in rural Iowa, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Mr. Cooper, my name is Eleanor Prescott, she began without preamble. I represent Consolidated Agricultural Investments Acquisition Division. I'll be direct. We're prepared to offer you $20 million for your uncle's property. Jackson maintained a neutral expression despite his internal alarm. They knew. Somehow they had connected him to the vault, to the evidence that could expose a century of their operations. "The scrapyard isn't for sale," he replied evenly. "It holds sentimental value." Eleanor smiled thinly. "We both know the property's value isn't in its visible assets. Your uncle had something that belongs to my organization documentation that was inappropriately obtained decades ago. We simply want to recover our property." "I'm not sure what you're referring to," Jackson said carefully. "My uncle left me a scrapyard full of old machinery." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a photograph that made Jackson's blood run cold. A black and white image from 1963 showing a much younger Uncle Hank standing alongside several men in suits. One face had been circled in red, a man Jackson recognized from the Coalition's records as William Prescott, former chairman of the financial institution that would eventually become TI. "My grandfather," Eleanor explained, noting Jackson's recognition. "He and your uncle had a complicated relationship. Henry Cooper appropriated certain sensitive materials during that relationship. Materials that have significant historical value to my organization." The implications were staggering. Uncle Hank hadn't just been the inheritor of the Coalition's work, he had actively infiltrated the very institutions they were monitoring, gathered evidence from within. His conspiracy theories had been first-hand observations. "I can't help you, Miss Prescott," Jackson said, maintaining his composure despite the revelation. "Whatever relationship existed between your grandfather and my uncle, whatever materials you believe he had, that's all before my time." Eleanor's professional demeanor hardened slightly. "$20 million is generous, Mr. Cooper. It would resolve your previous financial difficulties quite definitively. The alternative approaches would be less pleasant for everyone involved." The threat hung in the air between them, all the more menacing for its lack of specificity. Jackson thought of the warning note from months earlier. "They are watching." This wasn't just about recovering documents. This was about silencing potential exposure before it could begin. "I appreciate your offer," Jackson replied, standing to indicate the conversation was over. "But as I said, the property isn't for sale. Now if you'll excuse me, I have another appointment." Eleanor handed him a business card as she gathered her things. "The offer stands for 72 hours, Mr. Cooper. I suggest you consider it carefully. Some inheritances come with hidden costs." After she departed, Jackson immediately called an emergency meeting of the Foundation's leadership team. Within an hour, they had gathered at his farmhouse, the most secure location they could access on short notice. The implications of Eleanor's visit were disturbing on multiple levels. "They know about the vault," Jackson concluded after recounting the conversation. "Maybe not its exact contents, but enough to make that kind of offer." $20 million for a scrapyard, Carl whistled. "That's desperation talking." Rebecca was already analyzing the strategic implications. "This actually confirms something I've suspected based on Uncle Hank's records. The most damaging evidence isn't just about historical manipulation, it's about ongoing operations. They're worried about present-day exposure." Miranda, with her insider knowledge of banking operations, nodded in agreement. CAI's recent acquisitions make more sense in this context. They're not just consolidating agricultural lending, they're eliminating potential weak points where evidence might emerge. "What do we do?" Pastor Daniels asked, his normally confident voice tinged with concern. "If they're willing to offer $20 million openly, what might they be willing to do? Less openly?" Jackson had been considering this question since Eleanor Prescott had walked out the door. The threat was real. Powerful interests with vast resources now viewed them as a danger to be neutralized. But in that threat lay confirmation that their work mattered, that the evidence they held had the power to create meaningful change. "We accelerate," he decided. "The packages go out tonight, not tomorrow. The Hossie announcement moves up to next week. and we implement the contingency plan for the vault's contents. The contingency plan had been Rebecca's suggestion, creating multiple secure copies of the most critical evidence, distributed among trusted partners who would release everything publicly if any action was taken against the foundation or its leadership. Dead man switches designed to ensure that attempting to suppress the information would only guarantee its wider distribution. They're expecting us to be intimidated, Jackson continued. To take the money, or at least to delay while we consider it. Instead, we move faster. The next 48 hours unfolded with intense activity. The evidence packages were delivered by hand to their intended recipients, bypassing mail systems that might be monitored. The vault's contents were systematically duplicated, with digital copies secured in multiple locations and physical documents relocated to safety deposit boxes across 3 states. The Hasi announcement was finalized, with participating communities prepared for coordinated media coverage. Through it all, Jackson maintained his regular farm routines, tending livestock, checking equipment, preparing for the eventual spring planting. These tasks, which had once felt like a burden when his farm was failing, now provided essential grounding amid the escalating tension. The rhythms of agricultural life dictated by seasons and natural cycles rather than human drama reminded him of what they were fighting to preserve. On the morning the 72-hour deadline was set to expire, Jackson rose before dawn and walked his property line in the crisp winter air. The eastern sky gradually lightened, illuminating fields that his family had worked for generations. Fields that would have been lost without Uncle Hank's intervention, but which now represented something larger than one family's legacy. They were proving ground for a different approach to rural economics, one built on cooperation rather than exploitation. His phone rang as the sun crested the horizon, an unknown number. Jackson answered cautiously. "Mr. Cooper." Eleanor Prescott's voice was tighter than during their meeting. "I'm calling to inform you that our offer is withdrawn. Certain developments have forced us to reconsider our approach." "What developments would those be?" Jackson asked, though he could guess. "I think you know," she replied coldly. "Distributing stolen corporate documents to federal officials carries significant legal liability. Cy will be pursuing all available remedies." Jackson had anticipated this response. "The materials in question aren't corporate documents, Ms. Prescott. They're evidence of criminal activity spanning nearly a century, preserved by citizens concerned about the integrity of our financial systems. The distinction will matter considerably in both legal and public opinion contexts." A moment of silence followed. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice had lost some of its corporate polish. "This isn't over, Mr. Cooper. My grandfather spent his career building this organization. I won't allow his legacy to be dismantled by a farmer with delusions of populist heroism." "That's where you're wrong," Jackson replied calmly. "This was never about dismantling anything. It's about building alternatives, showing that different approaches to agricultural economics are not just possible but practical. Your grandfather's legacy isn't being threatened by me. It's being transcended by communities who've decided to write their own future." The call ended without further comment. Jackson pocketed his phone and continued his morning inspection, knowing that a new phase of their struggle had begun. Cy would respond legally, financially, perhaps in ways they hadn't anticipated. But they had momentum now, and something equally powerful, a compelling alternative to the status quo. By midday, the first ripples of their accelerated strategy were already visible. Senator Morrison's office announced the formation of a special subcommittee to investigate predatory lending practices in agricultural communities. One of the journalists who had received their package published a preliminary article outlining historical patterns of market manipulation targeting family farms. The National Family Farm Coalition issued a statement supporting the formation of agricultural cooperatives modeled on the Millerville approach. The foundation's offices buzzed with activity as phone calls poured in from farming communities across the Midwest. all asking variations of the same question. How can we do what you're doing? The Hasi announcement, planned for the following week, was already generating anticipatory interest as word spread through rural networks. That evening, as snow began to fall again, the Foundation's leadership team gathered at Jackson's farmhouse to assess their progress. The kitchen table where he had once sat alone, contemplating financial ruin, now served as the command center for a growing movement. Spread across its surface were maps, strategy documents, and reports from communities hoping to replicate their model. Eleanor Prescott called me too, Rebecca told the group. Tried to suggest my academic career would be over if I continued working with the Foundation. Said no university would touch a professor involved in corporate espionage and defamation. What did you tell her? Pastor Daniels asked. Rebecca smiled. I said I'd already received 2 offers for endowed chair positions specifically to study alternative agricultural economics based on our work here. Turns out what we're doing is considered groundbreaking in academic circles. Similar stories emerged from each of them. CA. I had reached out with personalized threats and inducements, attempting to fracture their coalition. None had succeeded. The shared purpose that had brought them together had proven stronger than individual fear or self-interest. They don't understand what they're fighting, Carl observed. They think this is about money or power. It's not. It's about community, about preserving a way of life that has value beyond financial calculations. Jackson nodded in agreement. 6 months ago, he had been focused solely on saving his own farm, on preserving his family's individual legacy. Now he understood what Uncle Hank had recognized decades earlier, that individual farms could only thrive within healthy, agricultural communities, and those communities required economic systems designed to support rather than extract from them. Tomorrow we go public with Hasi, Jackson reminded the group. Every participating community makes their announcement simultaneously. We show that what's happening in Millerville isn't an isolated phenomenon. It's the beginning of a transformation in how rural America approaches economic self-determination. As his friends departed into the snowy night, Jackson remained at the kitchen table, reflecting on the journey that had begun with a desperate excavation in a worthless scrapyard. The discovery of Uncle Hank's vault had provided the resources and evidence needed to launch their movement, but its true value had been in the vision it represented ordinary people taking extraordinary action to protect their communities when formal systems failed them. The original coalition of 1925 had preserved their community's financial resources during a banking collapse. Nearly a century later, their work continued in a new form, addressing not just the symptoms but the underlying structures that made rural communities vulnerable to exploitation. The gold from the vault had saved Jackson's farm, but the knowledge preserved alongside it was saving something far more precious, a way of life built on connection to land and community. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering fields that had endured drought and abundance, crisis and recovery. In that ancient, ongoing relationship between people and land, between communities and their economic systems, Jackson found renewed purpose. The struggle ahead would be challenging. Powerful interests weren't easily displaced, and systems didn't change without resistance. But they had momentum now, and something equally important, a vision of what success looked like, visible in the revitalization of Millerville itself. Jackson Cooper had inherited more than gold and historical documents from his eccentric uncle. He had inherited a tradition of practical idealism, of seeing problems clearly while refusing to accept that they couldn't be solved. That tradition now extended beyond his family, beyond Millerville, spreading to communities across the heartland that were reclaiming their economic self-determination one farm, one cooperative, one community bank at a time. As midnight approached, Jackson finally retired to bed, tired but profoundly satisfied. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new strategic adjustments, perhaps even new threats. But it would also bring another day of working toward a future where rural communities controlled their own destiny. A future made possible by a hidden vault, a century-old coalition, and the courage to imagine alternatives to accepted economic inevitabilities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Winter descended on Millerville with unexpected severity, blanketing the countryside in snow that transformed the landscape into a canvas of pristine white. 6 months had passed since Jackson Cooper discovered his uncle's vault, and the warning note that had appeared on his desk that night in late summer had proven prophetic. They were indeed being watched, and not just by one interested party. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Millerville Agricultural Heritage Foundation's office, a modest suite in the renovated former feed store on Main Street, hummed with activity despite the blizzard conditions outside. Jackson stood at the window, watching snow swirl in the streetlights as Rebecca and their small team prepared for tomorrow's critical meeting. The Midwest Agricultural Banking Association has confirmed, announced Eliza Martinez, the young lawyer who had joined their team 3 months earlier. Her expertise in financial regulation had proven invaluable as they navigated increasingly complex challenges. Their representatives will be here at 10 a.m., weather permitting. Jackson nodded, his expression revealing none of the tension he felt. Tomorrow's meeting represented both tremendous risk and extraordinary opportunity, the culmination of months of careful strategy. "And our documentation?" he asked, turning from the window. "Ready," confirmed Rebecca, gesturing to the organized files on the conference table. 3 separate packets. The historical evidence from Uncle Hank's records, the contemporary pattern analysis I've compiled, and the cooperative's financial performance data showing the alternative model's viability. What had begun as a desperate effort to save Jackson's farm had evolved into something far more significant. The Millerville Agricultural Cooperative, now encompassing 27 local farms and growing, had demonstrated remarkable success in its first 6 months. Crop yields had improved, operating costs had decreased, and most importantly, member farms were generating sustainable profits for the first time in years. This success had not gone unnoticed. The first sign of outside attention had come in the form of inquiries from the State Banking Commission, ostensibly routine regulatory oversight, but suspiciously focused on the foundation's funding sources. Jackson and his team had been prepared, providing carefully documented explanations that satisfied legal requirements, while revealing nothing about the vault's existence. More concerning had been the sudden interest from Heartland Agricultural Investments, a subsidiary of one of the financial institutions implicated in Uncle Hank's records. Their representatives had appeared in Millerville 3 months ago, offering to purchase struggling farms at prices well above market value, a textbook first move in the consolidation playbook documented in the vault's archives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the most significant development had been the unexpected alliance with Miranda Reynolds. The bank manager had made good on her offer of assistance, providing critical early warnings about inquiries into the foundation's activities. 2 months ago, she had taken an even more dramatic step, resigning from Millerville Community Bank to join the foundation as its financial director. "The regional banks are getting nervous," Miranda had explained during her job interview. "What you're building here threatens their agricultural lending model. They're used to cycles of debt dependency and occasional foreclosure. It's built into their profit projections. A self-financing agricultural community represents a serious disruption." Her insider knowledge had proven invaluable, helping them anticipate and counter increasingly sophisticated attempts to undermine their work. Now with tomorrow's meeting, they were taking their boldest step, yet directly engaging the very financial institutions whose practices they sought to reform. "Our security measures are in place," reported Carl, who had developed an unexpected talent for operational security. The mechanics who had once repaired farm equipment had become the Foundation's chief of protective measures, implementing protocols that would have made Uncle Hank proud. The vault's most sensitive contents had been relocated to 5 separate secure locations. Digital copies of critical documents were maintained on air-gapped computers with multiple redundant backups. Team members used encrypted communications and varied their routines. Most importantly, they had established a dead man's switch if anything happened to key personnel. Selected evidence would be automatically delivered to law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and trusted journalists. "We're not being paranoid," Carl had insisted when implementing these measures. "Your uncle's records show exactly how far these institutions will go when billions in agricultural assets are at stake." Jackson moved from the window to join his team at the conference table. "Let's review our approach one more time," he said, taking his seat at the head of the table. The strategy they had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than publicly exposing the evidence of market manipulation, which would likely trigger legal challenges that could tie up the information for years, they had decided to use it as leverage to negotiate structural reforms in agricultural financing. "We're not looking to destroy these institutions or even punish them for past actions," Jackson explained, a philosophy he had repeated often to keep the team focused. "We're looking to change how they operate going forward." Tomorrow's meeting with the Midwest Agricultural Banking Association represented the first test of this approach. The association's member banks controlled over 70% of agricultural lending in the region, making them both part of the problem and potentially part of the solution. "They're coming because they're curious and concerned," Miranda explained, her insider's perspective shaping their strategy. "The success of the cooperative threatens their narrative that family farms can't survive without their financing models. They'll want to understand what we're doing, assess whether we represent a genuine threat, and likely explore options for either neutralizing or co-opting our model." What they wouldn't be expecting was the carefully curated evidence Jackson's team planned to present, just enough to demonstrate that they possessed damaging information, not enough to reveal their full hand. "Remember, our goal isn't confrontation," Jackson reminded everyone. "It's transformation. We want them as partners in reform, not enemies fighting against it." As the team continued their preparations, Jackson stepped into his private office for a moment of reflection. On his desk sat a framed photograph of Uncle Hank standing beside a partially dismantled tractor, his eccentric grin capturing the spirit of a man who had seen deeper patterns where others saw only junk and spare parts. Next to it stood a newer photo, the first harvest celebration of the Millerville Agricultural Cooperative. Farmers who had been on the verge of losing everything now stood proudly in front of abundant fields, their faces showing not just relief but renewed purpose. Children played in the background, their future in the community no longer threatened by economic forces beyond their control. The contrast between these images, the solitary guardian and the thriving community, represented everything Jackson had come to understand about his uncle's vision. Hank hadn't preserved the vault's contents just to expose wrongdoing. He had protected them to enable something better to take its place. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca stood in the doorway, her academic demeanor softened by months of working directly with the farming families whose lives were being transformed. "The final projections just came in," she said, placing a tablet on his desk. "If current trends continue, the cooperative model could spread to 60% of county farms within 3 years. At that scale, it becomes self-reinforcing, too substantial for outside financial interests to disrupt through conventional means." Jackson studied the data. finding confirmation of what they had hoped but dared not assume. Their approach wasn't just working for a few lucky farms, it was potentially scalable across entire agricultural regions. "What about the processing facility?" he asked, referring to their most ambitious project yet. "Breaking ground in the spring, assuming tomorrow goes well," Rebecca confirmed. "The Community Investment Fund is fully subscribed. Local ownership of processing capacity changes everything, it breaks the monopoly control that's been squeezing farmers from both sides." The cooperative's planned processing facility represented a critical evolution of their strategy. By enabling member farms to process their own products locally, they would capture value that typically flowed to distant corporations. More importantly, they would gain direct access to consumer markets, reducing dependency on commodity pricing controlled by a handful of global companies. As evening deepened and the team gradually departed to rest before tomorrow's crucial meeting, Jackson remained in the office, reviewing their presentation one final time. The evidence they planned to reveal had been carefully selected, just enough to establish credibility, focused on patterns rather than specific individuals or transactions. Their leverage wasn't in threatening exposure, but in offering partnership. The financial institutions could continue fighting against inevitable change, or they could help shape reforms that would ultimately benefit both rural communities and their own long-term stability. Jackson believed, perhaps idealistically, that given the right incentives and faced with compelling evidence, even the most entrenched institutions could choose evolution over resistance. A text message from Carl interrupted his review. "Perimeter secure. All systems normal." Their security measures had become routine, a necessary precaution given the stakes involved. Jackson texted back his thanks, then gathered his materials to head home. The drive to his farm took longer than usual in the blizzard conditions, giving him time to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a desperate man digging in his uncle's scrapyard, seeking any possibility of saving his farm from foreclosure. Now he led an organization that was fundamentally reimagining rural economics, drawing on wisdom preserved through generations while applying it to modern challenges. As his truck turned onto the long drive leading to the farmhouse, headlights illuminated the Cooper Family Farm Est, 1885. Sign now accompanied by a smaller one, identifying it as a founding member of the Millerville Agricultural Cooperative. The farm itself had been transformed, not just financially secured, but revitalized through sustainable practices that honored both tradition and innovation. Inside the warm farmhouse, Jackson reviewed his notes one final time before allowing himself a few hours of sleep. Tomorrow would test everything they had built: their strategy, their unity, their vision for a different kind of agricultural future. Morning arrived with clearing skies and brilliant sunshine that turned the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling expanse. Jackson arrived at the foundation office early, finding Miranda already there, reviewing financial projections with characteristic thoroughness. "They're sending their A-team," she informed him, looking up from her computer. "The association president, their chief economist, and their head of agricultural lending. Plus legal counsel, of course." Jackson nodded, recognizing the composition as a sign they were being taken seriously. "Any last-minute intelligence?" "Just rumors," Miranda replied. "Word is they've been developing contingency plans for what they're calling community-based disruption of traditional agricultural financing. That's us, by the way," she added with a small smile. The team assembled as the meeting time approached, each person reviewing their role in the carefully choreographed presentation. At precisely 10 a.m., the association representatives arrived: 4 men and 1 woman, all dressed in conservative business attire that stood out in the casual setting of Millerville. Introductions were made with professional courtesy, though the tension in the room was palpable. These were not adversaries in the conventional sense. They were representatives of a system that had shaped rural America for generations, Now confronted with evidence that this system had often operated at the expense of the communities it claimed to serve. Jackson opened the meeting with a presentation on the cooperative structure and success, deliberately focusing on positive outcomes rather than grievances. The association's representatives listened with professional interest, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed their familiarity with the model's financial details. It was Rebecca who delivered the pivotal portion of their presentation, methodically outlining historical patterns of market manipulation documented in Uncle Hank's records, then connecting them to contemporary practices using her academic research. "What we're demonstrating," she explained, displaying graphs that showed striking correlations between lending practices and subsequent farm consolidation, is not random market evolution, but systematic extraction of agricultural assets through engineered cycles of debt dependency and foreclosure. The association representatives maintained poker faces, but their body language betrayed increasing discomfort as Rebecca continued. When she finally presented selected documents from the vault, internal memos from institutions represented in the room, detailing strategies explicitly designed to acquire farm assets through financial distress, the atmosphere shifted decisively. "These are serious allegations," said William Harrington, the association's president, his voice carefully neutral. "May I ask how you came into possession of what appear to be private institutional documents?" "They were preserved by a coalition of community members who witnessed the bank failures of 1925, Jackson explained, intentionally connecting their current efforts to the historical precedent. People who understood that sometimes preserving evidence is an act of community self-protection. What followed was not the confrontation many had feared, but a remarkably frank discussion of agricultural economics, past and present. The association representatives, initially defensive, gradually engaged with the substance of the evidence presented. Their questions shifted from challenging the documentation's authenticity to exploring the cooperative model that had demonstrated such promising results. By mid-afternoon, the conversation had evolved into something unexpected, a genuine dialogue about possibilities for reform. The association representatives proposed a joint working group to explore regulatory frameworks that would better support family farms while still allowing for profitable agricultural lending. Jackson's team countered with specific accountability measures that would prevent future market manipulation. As the meeting concluded with tentative agreements for ongoing collaboration, Jackson recognized they had achieved something profound, not victory in the conventional sense, but the beginning of a transformation. The financial institutions hadn't suddenly abandoned their self-interest, but they had recognized that adapting to community-centered models might be preferable to fighting against inevitable change. Outside the foundation office, as the association representatives departed, Miranda joined Jackson on the sidewalk, watching their expensive cars disappear down Main Street. "That went better than expected," she observed cautiously. "They're pragmatists," Jackson replied. "They saw enough evidence to know we could cause significant problems for them, and enough success in our model to recognize an opportunity rather than just a threat." "You think they'll actually follow through on the reforms they discussed?" Jackson considered the question carefully. "Some will, some won't, but we've changed the calculation. Before, the risk was all on the farming communities. Now there's risk on both sides." As they turned to go back inside, Jackson noticed a familiar figure across the street, David Mitchell, whose equipment repair business had been the first to benefit from the foundation's support. He was installing a new sign above his shop, Mitchell Agricultural Engineering, serving the Millerville Cooperative and beyond. The once struggling business now employed 3 additional mechanics, and it expanded into custom equipment designed specifically for sustainable farming practices. Similar transformations were visible throughout. Millerville, the grocery store, now prominently featuring locally produced foods. The vacant buildings on Main Street gradually filling with new businesses. The school that had been threatened with closure due to declining enrollment, now planning an expansion. These changes represented something more profound than economic recovery. They reflected a community reclaiming its agency, its identity, and its future. The money from Uncle Hank's vault had provided critical resources, but the real transformation had come from reconnecting people with their power to shape local systems rather than simply being subjected to distant economic forces. That evening, as the foundation team celebrated their successful negotiation, Jackson slipped away to visit the scrapyard where everything had begun. The property looked different, now organized rather than chaotic, with Uncle Hank's workshop renovated into a small museum documenting the history of rural financial resilience. The vault itself had been carefully secured but preserved as testimony to one man's extraordinary foresight and dedication. Standing in the quiet evening light, Jackson reflected on the journey from desperate excavation to community transformation. They hadn't just saved individual farms. They had recovered something more valuable, the belief that ordinary people working together could create systems that served their communities rather than extracting from them. The path forward would not be simple or straightforward. The financial interests that had shaped agricultural economics for generations would not transform overnight. There would be resistance, setbacks, and new challenges requiring continued vigilance and adaptation. But something fundamental had shifted in Millerville and was beginning to spread to surrounding communities. Farmers who had seen themselves as powerless against global economic forces were rediscovering their collective agency. Young people who had planned to leave rural America were finding reasons to stay and build. A community that had been gradually dying was discovering new vitality rooted in cooperation rather than competition. As twilight deepened into night, Jackson made his way back to the Cooper family farm, driving past fields that had sustained generations before him and would now continue sustaining generations to come. The desperate man who had rented an excavator as a last resort had discovered something far more valuable than gold bars and currency. He had uncovered a blueprint for community resilience preserved by those who understood that some treasures are measured not in dollars, but in human flourishing. In the farmhouse that had almost been lost to foreclosure, Jackson sat at his kitchen table and opened Uncle Hank's journal, reading again the words that had guided their journey. The greatest inheritance I can leave is not wealth, but wisdom, the understanding that true prosperity comes when communities control their own economic destiny. The vault's contents are merely tools. The real treasure is the knowledge of how to use them to build something that lasts. Outside, the winter stars shone brilliantly above snow-covered fields that would, come spring, burst into new life, just as Millerville itself had been reborn through the courage of one man who dared to dig beneath the surface, and the community that rallied to build something better from what they discovered together. The legacy of the 1925 bank vault wasn't just in the gold bars or historical documents it had preserved. Its true value lay in demonstrating that even in the most challenging times, ordinary people working together could create extraordinary change, a lesson as relevant in the present as it had been nearly a century before, and would remain for generations yet to come. Spring arrived in Millerville with unprecedented vigor, as if the land itself was celebrating the community's transformation. 2 years had passed since Jackson Cooper had unearthed his uncle's vault, and what had begun as one desperate farmer's last-ditch effort had blossomed into a movement that was reshaping agricultural communities across 3 states. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grand opening of the Millerville Agricultural Processing Center drew a crowd that spilled beyond the facility's expansive parking lot onto the adjacent fields. Farmers who had once competed against each other now stood shoulder to shoulder, pride evident in their weathered faces as they witnessed the culmination of their collective vision. The gleaming facility, cooperatively owned by 78 family farms, represented the keystone of their economic independence. Jackson moved through the crowd, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with characteristic humility. At 40, the lines around his eyes had deepened, but they were now laugh lines rather than marks of worry. The past 2 years had transformed him as profoundly as they had transformed Millerville itself. "Speech time, Mr. President," called Rebecca, using the title that still made Jackson uncomfortable despite having served as the cooperative's elected leader for 18 months. Taking his place at the podium, Jackson surveyed the gathering, not just local farmers, but representatives from agricultural communities across the Midwest, journalists from national publications, and perhaps most significantly, officials from both state and federal agricultural agencies. What had begun in Millerville was being studied as a potential model for rural revitalization nationwide. 2 years ago, Jackson began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. Many of us gathered here were facing the end of our family farming legacies. Banks were foreclosing, corporations were consolidating, and communities like ours were being hollowed out as young people left for opportunities elsewhere. He gestured toward the processing facility behind him, a state-of-the-art operation designed to handle everything from grain processing to dairy production to vegetable packaging. Today, we're not just surviving, we're thriving. Not because someone rescued us, but because we rediscovered something our grandparents and great-grandparents understood: the power of community economic cooperation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The journey to this moment had not been without challenges. The initial successes of the Millerville Agricultural Cooperative had indeed captured attention beyond their small community, not all of it welcome. 6 months after their pivotal meeting with the Midwest Agricultural Banking Association, they had faced their first major crisis. Heartland Agricultural Investments, the corporate entity that had been acquiring struggling farms throughout the region, had suddenly shifted tactics. Rather than continuing direct purchase offers, they had begun targeting the cooperative supply chain, acquiring the grain elevator that many member farms depended upon, and implementing pricing policies clearly designed to undermine the cooperative's viability. The move had been anticipated in Uncle Hank's records, a classic tactic documented in previous cycles of agricultural consolidation. But anticipation didn't make the challenge any less real. For several tense weeks, cooperative members had been forced to transport their harvest to facilities nearly 100 miles away, significantly increasing costs and threatening their precarious financial stability. The solution had come from an unexpected quarter. Miranda Reynolds, using her banking industry connections, had identified a potential ally in Regional Agricultural Credit Union, a member-owned financial institution with a long history of supporting family farms. Working together, the cooperative and the credit union had purchased the grain elevator, securing this critical infrastructure under community control. This early crisis had taught them a crucial lesson: owning the processing infrastructure was essential to long-term resilience. The planning for the Millerville Agricultural Processing Center had begun the very next day. Financing such an ambitious project had required innovation. Traditional lenders, still skeptical of the cooperative model despite its growing success, had offered terms that would have burdened member farms with unsustainable debt. Instead, the cooperative had developed a hybrid financing approach that combined member investments, community bonds, and strategic partnerships with values-aligned organizations. The most significant partnership had come through Rebecca's academic connections. The Rural Economic Innovation Center at State University had provided both technical expertise and credibility, helping design a facility that balanced cutting-edge efficiency with sustainable practices. Their involvement had also attracted grant funding for educational components that would make the center a learning hub for next-generation agricultural entrepreneurship. As Jackson continued his speech, he acknowledged these partners and the countless community members who had contributed to making the vision reality. But he also spoke about the deeper transformation that had occurred, how reclaiming economic agency had revitalized the community's spirit and sense of possibility. This facility represents more than economic infrastructure, he explained, gesturing to the building behind him. It represents a fundamental shift in how we think about community prosperity. We're moving from an extractive model, where wealth generated by our labor and our land flows to distant corporations, to a regenerative model where that wealth circulates within our community, creating opportunities for everyone. The evidence of this shift was visible throughout Millerville. Main Street, which had featured vacant storefronts just 2 years earlier, now bustled with activity. The cooperative's success had created a virtuous cycle: family farms with sustainable incomes, supported local businesses, which created jobs that allowed young people to remain in or return to the community, which in turn reinforced the customer base for both farms and businesses. Most encouraging had been the return of young people like Emma Mitchell, Carl's niece, who had left for college, swearing never to return to what she had seen as a dying town. Now she managed the cooperative's innovative direct-to-consumer program, connecting member farms with urban customers through technology that allowed city dwellers to subscribe to seasonal farm products while learning about the families who produced their food. The cooperative's impact extended beyond economics. The Millerville School, which had been considering consolidation with neighboring districts due to declining enrollment, had instead expanded its agricultural education program. Students now operated a working farm on school property, learning both traditional skills and cutting-edge sustainable practices while supplying the school cafeteria with fresh produce. Community health had improved as well. The local clinic reported decreased rates of stress-related conditions that had previously been endemic among struggling farm families. The suicide rate, tragically high in agricultural communities facing economic distress, had dropped to 0 in the county for the first time in decades. Perhaps most profound had been the restoration of generational continuity. Farms that had faced liquidation were now planning succession to children and grandchildren who saw viable futures in agriculture. The cooperative had established an innovative apprenticeship program pairing experienced farmers with young people interested in agricultural careers, but lacking family land or capital. As Jackson concluded his remarks, he recognized 2 special guests in the front row: Miranda's parents, who had lost their family farm during the 1980s farm crisis. In a particularly meaningful development, the cooperative had recently facilitated their return to farming through its land access program, which helped former farm families recover land that had been lost to foreclosure. "What we're celebrating today isn't just a building," Jackson said, his voice resonating with emotion. "It's the restoration of something precious that was nearly lost, the knowledge that rural communities can control their own economic destiny when they work together." The applause that followed reflected more than appreciation for a well-delivered speech. It carried the energy of a community that had rediscovered its agency and purpose, after years of believing that decline was inevitable. As the formal ceremony concluded and guests began touring the facility, Jackson stepped away for a moment of quiet reflection. Finding a secluded spot behind the building, he pulled from his pocket the small leather-bound notebook that had belonged to his uncle, the one physical item he had kept from the vault besides the essential evidence. 2 years of handling the fragile pages had left the binding even more worn, but the words inside remained as powerful as when he had first read them. Uncle Hank's observations, spanning decades of watching agricultural communities struggle against financial forces designed to extract rather than support, had provided not just historical context, but practical guidance throughout their journey. "The financial system isn't broken," one entry read. "It's working exactly as designed, just not for us. Our task isn't to fix it, but to build something better alongside it, something that serves community rather than capital alone." Jackson was so absorbed in his reading that he didn't notice Rebecca approaching until she spoke. "Still finding wisdom in there?" she asked, nodding toward the notebook. Jackson smiled, closing the worn cover carefully. Every time. It's like he anticipated every challenge we faced. That's because the playbook used against agricultural communities hasn't changed much in a century, Rebecca observed. Different technologies, same strategies. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Senator Catherine Williams, whose interest in the Millerville model had been instrumental in securing federal support for similar initiatives in other rural communities. The senator had grown up on a family farm before pursuing a legal and political career, and her understanding of agricultural economics made her a valuable ally. "Congratulations, Jackson," she said, extending her hand. "What you've built here is remarkable." "It's what we've built together," Jackson corrected gently, a response that had become habitual. "The cooperative has over 200 members now, each playing essential roles." The senator nodded appreciatively. "That collective ownership is precisely what makes your model so resilient. My committee is exploring legislation that would support similar cooperative development in rural communities nationwide. Would you be willing to testify at our upcoming hearings?" The request represented another expansion of what had begun as a local survival effort. In the past year, Jackson and other cooperative leaders had been increasingly called upon to share their experiences with policymakers seeking solutions to rural economic challenges. "Of course," Jackson agreed, "though I'd suggest bringing some of our younger members as well. They represent the future of this model." As the senator departed to continue her tour, Carl joined them, his characteristic practical focus evident in his expression. "National exposure is good," he acknowledged, "but we need to keep our eyes on the immediate challenges." Heartland Agricultural Investments just acquired 3 more processing facilities in neighboring counties. They're clearly trying to establish a regional monopoly. This ongoing pressure from corporate agricultural interests had been a constant throughout their development. As the cooperative model demonstrated success, the very entities whose practices they challenged had intensified efforts to control key infrastructure and resources. "That's why today matters so much," Rebecca responded. "With our own processing capacity, we've closed another vulnerability. The next step is expanding the network of cooperatives so we can create regional resilience, not just local." This vision of connected cooperative communities had been evolving over the past year as other farming regions reached out to learn from Millerville's experience. The Cooperative Corridor Initiative now linked 7 agricultural communities across 3 states, each adapting the model to their specific needs while maintaining the core principles of local ownership and economic sovereignty. As they rejoined the celebration, Jackson found himself approached by a young reporter from a national agricultural publication. "Mr. Cooper," she began, notepad ready, "most experts believe the decline of family farming was inevitable and natural economic evolution. Yet you've demonstrated a viable alternative. What made you believe this was possible when conventional wisdom said otherwise?" Jackson considered the question carefully. "I had access to something most farmers don't: historical evidence that what was happening wasn't natural evolution but engineered extraction. Once you understand that financial systems are designed rather than inevitable, you realize they can be redesigned to serve different purposes." "And the vault?" the reporter pressed. "There are still so many rumors about what you actually found. Some say Confederate gold. Others claim it was evidence of government conspiracy. Care to set the record straight?" Jackson smiled, having fielded variations of this question many times. The vault's existence was now public knowledge, though its full contents remained private. The story had taken on almost mythic qualities in telling and retelling. "What my uncle preserved wasn't just valuable because of its material worth," he explained. "Its true value was in the knowledge it contained, the understanding that throughout history, ordinary people have found ways to protect their communities from financial predation. We're just continuing that tradition with modern tools." As afternoon transitioned to evening, The celebration evolved into a community festival. Tables laden with locally produced food stretched across the grounds. Musicians played on a small stage, and children darted between hay bales set up for seating. The processing facility, with its cutting-edge technology and economic significance, provided the backdrop for something more fundamental, a community experiencing collective joy. Jackson found himself sitting with Carl and Rebecca at a table near the edge of the gathering, watching as 3 generations of Millerville residents celebrated together. "We should document this properly," Rebecca suggested, her academic instincts surfacing. "Future generations will want to understand how communities reclaim their economic sovereignty during this period." "Already happening," Carl replied with a smile, pointing to Emma Mitchell, who was recording interviews with cooperative members for what she called the Millerville Revitalization Archive. Their conversation was interrupted by David Mitchell, who approached with an elderly gentleman Jackson didn't recognize. "Jackson, there's someone you should meet," David said. "This is Harold Jenkins. He was friends with your uncle back in the day." The white-haired man extended a gnarled hand. "Hank and I worked together for years," he explained. "I just wanted to tell you, he'd be mighty proud of what you've done with what he left you." He always said the Cooper family understood what really matters. As the celebration continued into the evening, Jackson took a moment to walk the perimeter of the new facility alone. The golden light of sunset illuminated the surrounding fields, some already planted for the coming season, others being prepared. Fields that would have likely been consolidated into corporate megafarms were instead supporting dozens of families, each contributing to the community's collective prosperity. In the distance, he could see his own farm, the land his great-grandfather had first worked in the 1880s, that his grandfather had preserved through the Depression, that his father had modernized in the 1970s, and that Jackson himself had nearly lost before discovering the vault. Now it was not just secure, but thriving, with improved soil health from sustainable practices and diversified production that reduced vulnerability to market fluctuations. More importantly, it was part of something larger, a community of farms working together to create resilience no individual operation could achieve alone. The model they had built wasn't perfect, and challenges remained, but they had demonstrated that decline wasn't inevitable, that rural communities could chart their own course when given the right tools and knowledge. As darkness fell and stars appeared above the celebration, Jackson thought about legacy in a new way. His uncle's vault had preserved more than gold and currency. It had safeguarded the understanding that financial systems should serve communities rather than extract from them. Now that knowledge was alive again, spreading beyond Millerville to other communities facing similar challenges. The celebration would continue late into the night, but tomorrow would bring new work expanding their model, defending against inevitable challenges from entrenched interests, mentoring other communities beginning their own cooperative journeys. The path forward would require continued vigilance and adaptation, but they no longer walked it alone or without hope. Standing at the edge of fields that had supported his family for generations and would now support generations to come, Jackson Cooper felt something that had been rare in rural America for too long: certainty that the future could be better than the past, not through blind optimism, but through the practical work of building economic systems that valued community, prosperity above extraction and consolidation. The true treasure hadn't been gold bars or historical documents. It had been the blueprint for community resilience, preserved by those who understood that some inheritances are measured not in dollars but in wisdom, passed from one generation to the next, waiting for the moment when it would be needed most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.